Well, ladies and gentlemen, right now I would again officially like to welcome you all back and ask that Colonel Joe Milligan please come forward. He is the President, NAMPOW, and if he would like to make his way up here, he has some things that he would like to share with each and every one of you. I think he's here someplace. He's coming. These lights are so bright, I can't see the front of the podium, to be honest with you. But bottom line is, we're delighted to welcome you all, and again, we thank each and every one of you. Great to see you. It's all yours, my friend.
Great, thank you, Kate. Hey, I'm sorry it took me so long to get up here, but the reason is I am no longer the president of NAMPOWs, and so I'm sitting in the back over there somewhere. Okay. Well, our guest speaker today is Dr. Roger Shields. And Dr. Shields is a University of Florida graduate and received a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia in 1969. Dr. Shields served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for POW and MIA Affairs from 1971 to 1976. He was twice awarded the Department of Defense's Distinguished Civilian Service Award. And following the war in Vietnam, he led the POW MIA task force seeking accounting for those who did not return. Now, my fellow NAMPOWs, you all best remember Dr. Shields as being the person in charge of and overseeing the planning and execution of Operation Homecoming. I first met Dr. Shields on the 18th of February, 1973, on the C-141 that took me from Hanoi back to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And I had a lot of emotions going through my mind on that flight coming home. Awful lot of adrenaline flowing through the bloodstream. But there's one thing that I've always remembered from that trip, and that is the fact that I was in awe of the fact that a high-ranking government official such as Dr. Shields was on the airplane to escort us home. And I have never forgotten that. And the next time I saw Dr. Shields was at one of our NAMPOW reunions many years ago. And I have with me a copy of, first edition copy of Honor Bound book. And since this was published, I carry this around with me to all the NAMPOW reunions that I attend. And at one of those reunions, Dr. Shields signed my book. And I'm gonna read you the inscription that he signed. He said, "Joe, thanks for all you've done. It's an honor for me to know you and to have been your friend. Best wishes, Roger Shields." I've read that inscription many times, and I've always thought that he kind of had that backwards. Because, in my opinion, it is we, the NAMPOWs, for whom it has been an honor to know Dr. Roger Shields and to have been his friend. And ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Roger Shields.
I guess since you found out I graduated from the University of Florida, I've got to say, go Gators. And happy to hear that response. I was wondering what we were going to have on the menu tonight. I was hoping that it would be sewer greens and pumpkin soup, but I can't get around to that because I think it was all consumed in North Vietnam a long time ago. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here with you to celebrate the 45th anniversary of Operation Homecoming and 45 years of freedom for the men who came back from those communist prison camps in North Vietnam and in South Vietnam. About 47 years ago, I was wondering if this day today was ever going to come. I'm grateful that it did. I'd like to begin my remarks by going back a few years before Operation Homecoming. The saga of the prisoners and missing in Vietnam from that conflict actually goes back to the late 1950s, 1958, 1959. But I'd like to begin with 1969. 1969 was a very important year because of three events that happened that affected our men that were being held captive, their families at home, and the missing in action. In May of 1969, the policy that the United States government had followed since the beginning of the issues when we began losing men was turned around 180 degrees. That policy was one that I would characterize as benign neglect because it was a policy that de-emphasized the prisoner of war issue, tried not to give it any publicity, and asked the families of our prisoners and missing not to talk about their losses or the plights that they had and the burdens that they were carrying themselves. The beginning of 1969, many of our men, as you know, were beginning their fourth and fifth years in captivity. We didn't know an awful lot about the conditions of captivity at that time. We didn't know the number of men that we had in captivity. We had ideas about who were prisoners and who among our men were missing. Porter Halliburton was killed in action, except he wasn't, as we know tonight, and he'll tell you that he's very much alive. We based status determinations on the best information that we had available. And in many cases, that was not much more than sophisticated guesswork, and in some cases, not so sophisticated at all. But we did know that the men were being treated under brutal conditions. We're living under brutal conditions in the prison camps in South Vietnam. The conditions were horrible. And close to 25% of the men that the South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, admitted that they had prisoners. About 25% of them failed to return home, having died in captivity. And in the North, we knew that the conditions were brutal and, as I said, inhumane. And so it was time that we recognized that that policy of benign neglect, forgetting about publicizing the issue, resorting to what the State Department would characterize as back-channel negotiations, had failed completely. And so in May of 1969, that policy was changed and the decision was made to go public on the issues that we had, to try and put pressure on the North Vietnamese and on their allies, the communist allies, by publicizing this issue and emphasizing the fact that everyone in that conflict was bound by the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war and the conditions that Geneva Convention called for, which were being flouted completely by an insensitive and intransigent government in North Vietnam and their communist allies. And so shortly after that, after the decision was made to go public, two resolutions were passed that were very important. One resolution was passed in the United Nations. The other was published, was proclaimed in an international conference of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and it called on all parties to the conflict in Southeast Asia to honor their commitments by which they were legally bound in the Geneva Conventions. that policy had a downside, and was recognized before the policy change was made. And the downside was that that was going to create more leverage on the part of the governments that were holding our men prisoner. And in fact, that did occur. We learned later on, we saw shortly in the Paris peace talks that the demands on us to return our men had increased from the simple withdrawal of U.S. military forces to include cessation of support to Vietnam, South Vietnam, and a number of other things as well. But it was recognized that that was worth the cost that it was, and hopefully there was an upside to that as well, that the communists would recognize when our men were in the position of their loss, that an American who was alive was a lot more important than one who was not in good condition or had been killed. So we hoped that that was going to work. The most important thing that happened as a result of going public was freeing the families to talk about the loss of their loved ones and the burdens that they were bearing. And that resulted immediately in a huge outpouring of support, not just from the United States and private citizens in the United States, but from citizens around the world and their governments. The Vietnamese were put on notice, and the results seemed to be positive almost immediately. More mail was received from those communist prison camps in North Vietnam, and it seemed that more packages being sent to our men were getting through. In addition to that, the Vietnamese at the Paris peace talks began to talk about the prisoner of war issue in different terms. They would talk constantly about, and I quote, their humane and lenient treatment of all the people that they were holding captive. Not true? They were beginning to feel this kind of thing. Then in August of 1969, Douglas Hegdahl was released, and when he came out with 350 some odd names and told us about the conditions, some of the physical conditions of men who were being held prisoner. Before that, we didn't know an awful lot. We didn't know the numbers. We weren't sure what was going on, and that was a huge quantum increase in our intelligence and our information. So that was very welcome. And then following that, the next month, September of 1969, Ho Chi Minh died. And we learned in your debriefs when you came home that the prison guards and prison administrators had a slightly different view of what they had done in the past, and seemed to be a little bit more friendly. And hopefully accompanied by an increased appreciation of the things that they needed to do to keep you alive to come home. Nevertheless, after these things happened, we continued to push on, still not knowing, and our intelligence was lacking, still not knowing what was happening. So in 1970, we had the most important thing of the war for that year, the conflict regarding the prisoners and missing, and that was the Sante raid. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, I think, deserves a great deal of credit for the courage he exhibited when he gave the go-ahead for that raid to take place. It was apparent to most people in the Pentagon who had looked at the issue that that prison camp had been vacated and that our raiders were likely to find empty cells, which is what happened. But you know as well that raid had benefits beyond freeing men, bringing more people together, improved your communications, and put the North Vietnamese on notice again. In the meantime, we had encouraged the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, to begin to move the people who had been captured in the South to the North. And we saw some of that happening and thought that that was an indication that they were more concerned about taking care of people, increasing the number of prisoners that they held, and that would help. Despite those gains and those initiatives that were being made, it was very clear in the Department of Defense that we were not organized to take on the responsibilities that we needed to fulfill the way we were doing things. The different military services were pursuing their own policies. There was not a lot of coordination. There was not a great deal of discussion about how we ought to do things uniformly. Families were being supported by each military service according to their own standards. And even within each military service, the administration of those standards was very spotty. We needed to improve our intelligence. We needed to do a lot of things. So the Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Task Group was created. And the military representatives to that task group were at the flag and general officer level, men who could speak with authority for their service secretaries and chiefs. Other relevant offices in the Department of Defense had senior representatives as well. At the same time, the Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Task Force was created as a staffing agency for the task group. And immediately that task group began to function. It was charged with being in charge of all efforts within the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, relative to our prisoners and missing. There were a few responsibilities that remained outside of the task group, where by law, other individuals had to be responsible. Status changes, for example, status determinations could only be made by the service secretaries. But beyond that, everything was lodged in the task group, and the task group began to function. We did some things at that time that were aimed again at putting public pressure, international pressure, on the North Vietnamese and their communist allies. Things that were sanctioned and indeed encouraged by the Geneva Convention. For example, we called publicly, again in Paris, for the immediate release of all sick and wounded prisoners. We called for the immediate release of all men who had been held over a long period of time. And since the longest an American prisoner of war from a foreign war action had ever been held prisoner was 3.5 years, had the communists accepted, most of our men would have been released. Of course they didn't, and we were not surprised that they didn't. We tried to have a unilateral release of 1,500 North Vietnamese prisoners. Thought that that would be a big show again to give them back without asking anything in return. But we failed to do that because when we asked the North Vietnamese prisoners that we held to go back, not one was willing to go. We also proposed that there be internment camps set up in neutral countries, as called for again under the Geneva Conventions. But since our prison camps, which were administered by the South Vietnamese but with U.S. advisors in them, since that was the case, only one country, Sweden, agreed to offer its territory for neutral internment, and of course the North Vietnamese again were intransigent and not interested in doing this. But the pressure was there, and they were on the defensive in the public forums in the world, talking again about their lenient and humane treatment. We also proposed a prisoner exchange, and in fact, we did have one prisoner exchange that worked. Not the one that we'd planned or that we thought about, but as a result of a CIA operation when went awry. Sergeant John Sexton of the Army had been captured when his armored personnel carrier was destroyed. He had a badly injured elbow. He was held prisoner for 2 years, and then he was told that he was going to be released because he was going to be exchanged for someone that the North Vietnamese wanted very badly. He was taken to 3 or 4 different release points. Nothing happened. No one was there. And finally, he was sent down a road in the middle of the night and told to enter a U.S. military installation, which was just down the road, and give this message demanding that we, the United States, fulfill the obligation that we had about this prisoner exchange. And he did that. The message made its way to Army intelligence, and very shortly in the National Military Command Center, I heard that message and said, well, you know, I don't know anything about this, which I didn't. I'd never heard of anything like this. But I said, if they're interested in a prison exchange, let's go ahead and make an exchange and see if we can build this into something bigger. So we found a North Vietnamese lieutenant, and this time he was a prisoner of ours, and this time we told him that there was an agreement between the two sides, and the American had already been released, and we were going to release him. We sent him marching up the road, never heard anything more from him. It turned out that the North Vietnamese were not looking for a North Vietnamese Army lieutenant. They were looking for a man that they had sent south to take control of all intelligence activities in South Vietnam. We didn't do a good job of coordinating our efforts in interagencies, and I was sorry that we had never heard that. It turned out that Secretary Laird had been given a brief briefing on this operation and then sworn to secrecy, so that no one in the Department of Defense had any idea that this was going on. These kinds of things happen. We continued to work very much on our intelligence activities because that was critical. Our intelligence that we had from North Vietnam, and particularly from Laos, was always sketchy. In Laos, almost nothing. The Cooper Church Amendment in the later years of the war kept us from even putting anyone in the ground there. And so we needed to improve our intelligence activities. And the subcommittee in the Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Task Group under Commander Chuck Trowbridge, who was head of the Prisoner of War and Missing in Action branch of DIA, expanded its opportunities. We had the most important source of intelligence, of course, came from your letters, the letters of our men held in the camps in North Vietnam, particularly some writers who were a little bit more productive than others, and those of you who are in the prison camps will know what I'm talking about. That was our best source of intelligence. We also had aerial photography from reconnaissance aircraft, from drones, satellite imagery, and we were gratified to know at the end of the conflict that we had identified every prison camp that our men were held in, except for one, and that was one in Hanoi that had been used to house primarily men captured in the South and who'd been brought up to the North. So we worked on those kind of things. At this time, getting into mid-1971, we realized that there was going to be a repatriation. The repatriation planning, Operation Homecoming, had begun actually in 1966 and 1967, but it was very sketchy, not very well coordinated, hadn't been updated, and so this time we realized that the United States was withdrawing its forces, and this was something, the repatriation was something that was going to happen. The planning had been done under the name of Egress Recap, which was not a very exciting name, so we changed it to Operation Homecoming. The goal that we had for Operation Homecoming was one that we knew was impossible to reach, absolutely impossible. But we decided that our reach needed to exceed our grasp, and so we decided that we were going to do everything we could to make sure that the time in captivity and the conditions of captivity would have its effects neutralized by Operation Homecoming. It would be neutralized on your military careers, with regard to your health, mental health, and physical well-being. All these things would be neutralized. The relationships with your family, we would do our best to neutralize the effects of captivity as well. And then the fourth thing that we were worried about and concerned about were the debriefing processes. And so we had extensive planning going into Operation Homecoming. The best medical advice that we could find. We had experts with regard to family reunions. We talked to many people, to the families. We did a lot of these things, and those processes began to take form. Literally hundreds of people, escort officers, casualty assistance officers for the families, all briefed on the processes for Operation Homecoming. I had gotten involved in this in the middle of this, and I needed an education of my own because I'd been involved in the process of Vietnamization, but I was distant from the problems of prisoner of war and missing in action. So the National League of Families, very much involved, decided that I needed to be educated. And so very early on, I received a visit from two officers of the League. One of them was the wife of a man, Air Force man missing in North Vietnam. The other was the wife of a Marine helicopter pilot missing in Laos. They came into the Pentagon, I think, to size me up, and probably were disappointed in what they saw. One of those two who visited me in my office at that time is here tonight. She was Carol Hansen at that time. She's now Carol Hickerson, and I was very grateful for what she did. To get on her good side, she came into the office with her young son, Todd, who was here with us tonight too, and we babysat him while she had other business to do. It was a little bit of a bribe. We were grateful for the families and what they did. Their role cannot be underemphasized. They were so critical and they worked so hard. There are wives here tonight who worked on that process back at that time before you came home. And if they're here, those who are here, I'd like to have stand up tonight so that they can be recognized. As I say, their role cannot be overemphasized. And they were so great when Operation Homecoming was coming into play, because they were just as concerned and just as nervous probably as you who were coming home. Operation Homecoming, as I said, involved massive numbers of men and women working in the various different areas. As we began to plan Operation Homecoming, we were working under some severe constraints. First of all, again, we did not know how many men were coming home. In fact, one woman did come home, a German lady who was a nurse, but we did not know how many people we were going to be processing. Nor did we know where they were going to be released. Just in September of 1972, there were 3 men who were released early, and they were released through Eastern Europe. So we felt that we had to be prepared to receive men wherever you might be released. So accordingly, we had 3 primary processing centers. One was Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, which is the one that we used and the one that we preferred. The second one was the Guam Hospital of the Guam Naval Air Station. And the third was Landstuhl Army Hospital in Europe. We were prepared to activate either of these 3, any of those 3 places, and they would have been fully capable of doing what we ended up doing in Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. Remember that we had never received an official list of our prisoners and missing from the other side. After we began to put pressure on them, they felt pressure to tell us something, and so there were partial lists that were passed out to anti-war activists. Senator Kennedy received a possible list, but these were unofficial lists, and as we found out, they were not complete. So we didn't know how many men we were going to have to process. We didn't know where you were coming, and perhaps the biggest thing of all, we didn't know a lot about your physical conditions. And so we mandated that every evacuation aircraft have a bed and a seat for every man on the plane. And we mandated that there be medical crews who are completely ready and competent to meet almost any contingency that might arise with regard to a person's physical condition while being transported back to Clark and then on to the United States. So we did that. There were other things which we needed to do at that time that were very important, and so we were very involved in the planning of the Paris peace talks. We provided the format and the bulk of the information and processes that went on in Section 8B of the Paris Peace Agreements. That was a section pertaining to the release of men and an accounting of those who are missing, who did not come home. And so we mandated several things in that. You were aware of the fact that we asked that you be notified in your prison camps of the conditions of release, the approximate times when people would be released, and the order in which people would be released. We also asked that you be gathered into an area where we would be able to pick you up closest to your places of last detention, and the North Vietnamese and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of Vietnam agreed to that, and so we were able to go to Hanoi, Gia Airport, and then An Loc in South Vietnam for the handful of prisoners who were released there. So we worked that out. There was another very important part of that agreement that we insisted on, and that was that the implementation of Article 8 be completely separate from anything else in the agreement. We did not want to have your release aborted or delayed because the two Vietnamese parties got into a fight about something, or because in the United States, where we were talking about financial support for North Vietnam and so forth, things that could have been very contentious, and had that not been separate, they could have been, your release could have been caught up in all of that. But we agreed to put it in. They were included, and so we felt that Operation Homecoming was ready to go. Frank Sieverts, who is my counterpart at the State Department, and a man who works ceaselessly for you, I viewed him, he was a longtime staffer in the State Department, but I viewed him as a Defense Department mole over in the State Department. He was with us. He was an activist, and he was with us. We said that we had to go out to Clark to make sure everything was ready to go, and we had to take care of things, that planning and the actual repatriation ourselves. We were told that we were too senior, that this was going to be a mundane operation, low level, low key, couldn't have anyone of our exalted rank. Well, that's the first time I'd ever been told I had an exalted rank. But in any case, Frank and I said no, things could happen. And as I'm going to mention in a minute, something did. And we insisted on going out. So we went out to Clark to see that everything was in readiness. We had 3 conferences of all the DOD key people. The military commands had their own command centers set up for this, to activate the processes for their own returnees. And we wanted to make sure that everything was in sync and everything was working. Well, when we got to Clark, I found out that things were pretty well set and we're going to go. The problem was that since Frank and I were too important to be the heads of the U.S. delegation, we had to find a head. So a needle was spun, and it fell on the name of Colonel Dennett, U.S. Air Force Colonel Dennett, who was informed that he was going to be the head of the U.S. delegation that sat at the table at Jilam Airport to receive you. Colonel Dennett, like any reasonable person, protested and said, look, I have nothing to do with Operation Homecoming. I don't know anything about it. I'm not going to be responsible for things that I can't control and I don't know anything about. I put my arm around his back and patted him on the back and said, don't worry, you're going to have 2 of the best advisors that anyone in the world could ever produce for you. You're going to be taken good care of. And so Colonel Dennett pulled out of the ranks the day before he was to go to Hanoi for the first release on February 12th, became the head of the U.S. delegation. I had also been informed that the communication network that we had to have was going to be in good shape and prepared, and everything was ready to go. Colonel Craig Bergen, Air Force, told me, he said, Dr. Shields, you better go talk to the Army people. They're in charge of this, and you better go talk to them about this. So I did, and half an hour later, my head was spinning. I had visions of a battalion of combat engineers going up to Hanoi 2 or 3 days before with the bulldozers and cranes putting up a 1,500-foot antenna, which the North Vietnamese would never have allowed. And Colonel Bergen said, I have a pack that I can put on the back of a Jeep. We'll roll it up into the C-130 and you're going to be fine. And so that's what we did. It was very critical because all the major military commands had to be involved. The North Vietnamese, ever anxious to put a burr under our saddle, had told us that we could only have 1 C-141 on the ramp at Jilam at a time because it just wasn't big enough. Well, that turned out to be false. And so we had to have 2 aircraft orbiting out in the Gulf of Tonkin while the one was sitting there receiving a group, for the first group. So we got that taken care of. The other problem was a public affairs problem. The public affairs people said, this low-key operation, this mundane operation is going to be covered by every major news agency in the world. It's going to be given television coverage, worldwide television coverage, satellite television coverage, very mundane, very low-key. So they had thought that we would park that C-141 when it came in way out in the field. unroll a carpet that would go down one side of a rectangle, and then go down the line of people who'd come out from Clark to welcome our men back, and then another side of the rectangle going back to the bus. That would have been a march of about 600 yards. I thought that was a little bit too much, and later on, Ray Voden, whom you remember had a serious leg injury, said, you know, I'm sure glad you got that fixed, because he says, I wasn't ready to take that 600-yard march. I said, we're going to park the aircraft closer to the people, we're going to bring the buses up, and we're going to have a red carpet that goes from the aircraft over to the buses, and this is what you saw. So we fixed that up. It was a work a plan that had great planning going into it. It was an opportunity of a lifetime for me when you have a chance to plan something, and then you have a chance to carry out that plan. Often doesn't happen. And unlike war plans that don't survive the first shell burst, this worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. People did exactly what they were told to do because of the scrutiny that they were under, and they were all saying to an individual, I'll do my part, I'm not going to ad-lib, I'm going to do what the plan calls for, and if it doesn't work, it's the fault of someone up the line. Well, that up the line came up to me, and I wanted to look to the Secretary of Defense, but Melvin Laird was gone, and the new Secretary of Defense, Elliot Richardson, had just gotten into the office and told me, he said, I don't know anything about this. I don't know what you planned or what you're doing. It's on you, Roger. Well, it was. I was happy to do that because I thought we had planned and we'd made everything go well. And it worked, as you know, according to plan. There was no problem. We had agreed that the men would be released from Clark as soon as they were able to go physically, as soon as the doctor said everything was fine. You would talk to your families. You'd had a chance to look at your pay and allowance accounts. You'd had a chance to do some shopping. You had the packet that told you about your family, the current state of your families. Everything that we did, the uniforms that we had ready for you with your current rank and insignia on them, all of that had been carefully planned, carefully implemented, and as I said, the people who were doing it out of a labor of love, and also because they wanted to make things work. So for me, it worked very well. There were a couple of things that I worried about as that C-130 went up to North Vietnam, to Hanoi. It had made 2 trips before that to help with the implementation of some of the things that had to do with the Paris Peace Agreement. So I was confident that we knew what we were doing, but as we turned in over Nam Dinh to go to Hanoi, I looked down and I saw AAA sites and SAM sites, and I thought, I hope that their planning has been as good as ours, and that these people got the word that we're friendly. Well, it seemed like it was going very well, and I was up on the flight deck of the C-130 as we got closer. The North Vietnamese air traffic controller came on, and I heard, Air Force High, to which our aircraft commander replied, Roger, cleared to 9. And a few minutes later, the same thing came on, Air Force High, Roger, turning right and cleared to. When we got on the ground, I told that man, I said, you know, you're the best linguist I've ever heard in my life. I couldn't understand a word that air traffic controller said. And he said, well, neither could I, but that was the flight plan, and so I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I mopped my brow and hoped everything was going to be fine. We went into the conference room at Gia Lam, and we sat there for several hours. The release had been scheduled earlier. Everything had been scheduled, and all they had to do was bring the buses out from the prison camp, and nothing happened. We ended up talking about the weather in North Vietnam and what it was like up on the Chinese border and how it compared with Washington's climate. Finally, I said, what is the holdup? We've got 2 aircraft that are orbiting out there and over the water. We need to get on with this process. And the Vietnamese Brigadier General looked at me and said, don't worry, it'll happen. I went up with the Presidential Commission of Carter 4 years later, and the Paul Doumer Bridge was in a lousy shape at that time. There were more holes in it than there were planks to hold cars and stuff. I had visions of buses falling into the river and all kinds of things happening. Finally, the buses came out and people were repatriated, and we were grateful for that. It was a moment that I will never forget. I will never forget that as long as I live. To see the men come out with pride held high. The uniforms that you were wearing, the clothes you were wearing were respectable, and you had a dignity about you that no one could ever forget who was there. So it was a grand moment. We got in that aircraft, and you know the story there, as you came back to Clark. It was wonderful, and that first release was perfect. There was a problem, however, because the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, told Henry Kissinger, who had gone up there again right after our first release, that they were going to give him a present. And the present that they were going to give him was a release of 20 men 6 days later, not according to the schedules. And as I looked at the list of men, it was very obvious to me that this had not followed the plan of sick and wounded and longest held. So that was something that was very, very bad, and I worried about how it was going to be received by the men who were going to be repatriated. So I went up for that second release 6 days after the first, and took with me the meanest looking colonel that the Air Force had. We sent him into Wallow prison camp to talk to Norm Gaddis, who was a senior ranking officer for that release. And Colonel Robson said, look, this is a gift, this is a special release, 20 people should go, you're gonna go. Our view was, whatever they wanted to release and when they were gonna do it was fine with us. We weren't gonna say, no, we're not gonna accept these 20 men. It wasn't gonna happen. But we were worried that you were gonna say that, and we could see the headlines that say U.S. prisoners of war refused repatriation. So Colonel Robson convinced Norm Gaddis, and 20 men came home. I don't know how the 20 men were chosen. We didn't ask. It was not an issue with us. The fact that you were coming out was important to us. I think people like Joe Milligan have been worried for a long time, needlessly, about whether they were early releasees. The answer is that you weren't. You had to do what you had to do because we weren't going to turn down that special release. It was very important to us, and it happened, and we processed it. It worked very, very well, so I'm grateful for that. I will never forget that night in the at Clark Air Base. A lot of bedlam, a lot of chaos. We had provided gruel and pablum in case your tender stomachs were not able to process it. That was thrown away quickly, and you went to the hamburgers, the steaks, and the hot dogs. All ice cream, sundaes, it worked well. In the middle of all that hubbub, I received some memos from some of the senior ranking officers. I remember three, one from Jerry Denton, one from Harry Jenkins, and one from Howie Rutledge. And at the bottom, they were signed with something that looked like GBU, and then they signed their names. I couldn't figure out what GBU meant. I was afraid that it had been so long since they had written that they meant to write CBU and disguise the C as made it look like a G. I knew what a CBU was, a cluster bomb unit, and I thought, is this so bad that these men want to blow me up? I asked Howie Rutledge about that. I said, what does this mean? He says, it means something that's very important to us. He says, we used it in the prison camps, and we use it with meaning. It isn't just a nice thing, sincerely yours, or we're happy to see you, or truly yours, truly. He says it's something that means a lot to us. It's God bless you. And so I will tell you tonight, God bless you, and God bless America.
I have a gift. I'm not going to make you come back up on the stage. We have a gift for you. Okay. in commemoration of your being here with us tonight. It's our way of saying thank you for all you've done for us. And we hope that whenever you look at this plaque, that you will remember the high esteem with which we, the NAMPOWs, hold you in. And we're forever grateful.
I'm indebted to all of you. Thank you for being here and for giving me the privilege of being here.
Thank you.
And Joe, you are still my good friend.
Thank you. Appreciate it.